Chapter 8, Foxes, 1979. The four girls, all jammed into the cab of the pickup, started breathing easier once Jeannie swung onto the freeway and had the pickup tearing along the fast lane towards the valley. Jeannie gave Annie, perched by the door, a "you are not to be believed" look. "You're on probation, you dumb shit. You're supposed to stay out of Hollywood."
Oh my god.
"Well, Loser," said Annie, throwing up her hands. "Loser was taking me home." "Hey, stay away from Loser. He's in a street club," said Jeannie. She swung expertly right and back into her lane to bypass a panel truck. "I wanted to get home and talk to my mom before Dad gets there," Annie said, sweeping her billowy hair back over each ear with both hands. "He wants to put you in a hospital, you know," Madge said, laying a worried hand on Annie's
What?
arm. "A hospital?" A strange look flashed across Annie's face. "For severe maniacs," said Jeannie, giving Annie
Oh
an
my
only slightly
God.
ironical look. He can't do that," said Annie, with a tinge of
What?
fear in her voice, looking from one to another of her three friends. Madge put her hand reassuringly on her arm again. "Oh, yeah?" said Jeannie. She cut swiftly from the left to the center to the right lane and slid off the freeway on the Lancashire exit. "I am totally freaked," said Annie, in a half-flip, half-frightened tone. She shrank back against the door and clutched her arms to herself. After writing a minute in silence, she leaned down and rummaged in her bag, pulling out a pint of silver rum. She uncapped it and took a couple of quick swigs. The other girls pretended it wasn't happening. The black pickup rattled to a stop next to one of the towering fan palms that loomed over the street of single-story houses. The Malik's L-shaped three-bedroom flat-roof stucco house was distinguished from those on either side by virtue of its having a garage, not a carport, and a line of tall, slender cypress trees adorning the long side of the L. The doors on the two-car garage were both open, the bays empty. The turquoise-painted front door was closed. Nothing moved behind the flowered drapes to indicate that people were at home. "You don't see his car?" asked Jeannie, leaning forward on the steering wheel, scanning the half-dozen parked cars on either side of the empty street. "Nope," said
No.
Annie, scrunched so low in the seat that her eyes barely peered over the dash. She was hugging her arms to her chest and letting a cigarette burn down in her fingers. "What about your mom?" asked Jeannie. "She doesn't have a car anymore," said Annie, sliding lower. Jeannie hopped out of the pickup and strode up to the low stone front porch. She shaded her eyes and peered in at a front window. She rapped lightly at the door and waited. Finally, she pushed down the thumb latch and stuck her head in the door. "Mrs. Malik?" No answer. She called a little louder, then opened the door wide and walked into the darkened front room. She crossed softly in front of a giant fake mahogany console television set on top of which perched a plaster Venus figurine at one end and a plaster Michelangelo's David at the other. She padded stealthily across the salt and pepper wall-to-wall carpeting into the hallway and down to Annie's bedroom. Annie's room was large, with big windows on two sides and a long, low, blonde veneered chain store dresser against one wall. The opposite wall was covered with hundreds of fashion model cutouts from Vogue and Bazaar, and in the center, a larger-than life-size poster of Al Pacino. Over the dresser was a 10-foot-long mirror. On the wall, over one of the single beds, was an oval mirror with a rococo frame that looked antique but was plastic. The sliding door to the closet was a floor-to-ceiling mirror. Jeannie went right to the closet and snatched up a Fleetwood Mac tote bag. Working fast, she hit the drawers containing underpants, t-shirts, roll tops, knee socks, and leotards. She stuffed a selection into the tote, then propped it against the top of the bureau and shoveled in a tangle of gold chains, beads, necklaces, hoop earrings, lipsticks, mascara tubes, combs, eye pencils. She stood up and listened, thinking she heard something. She bent back to the bureau, this time picking through the dozens of stuffed animals. She turned to the beds, covered with stuffed toys, and searched some more. Finally, she found what she was looking for. It was half buried under a yellow-hatted Paddington bear. She rolled the bear over and picked up the doll with 2 fingers as though it were a dead carp. The object of much love, Annie's favorite childhood toy, was a baby Bumpkins doll. Now, so bedraggled it looked like a refugee. Its scarred rubber head had lost all the orangish straw-like hair from the left side, as though in a terrible accident. The china eyes rolled around in the deep eye holes like ghosts in the cellar. The little doll wore green cotton pajamas that were faded and frayed around the feet. Annie still insisted on sleeping with the doll, named Googs, which she'd had for almost 10 years. Mrs. Malik, in a light moment, once told Jeanie how Googs was Annie's first ill-gotten gain. At the age of 6, Annie had seen Googs in an F.A.O. Schwartz catalog, and having just learned to print, managed to order it all by herself. F.A.O. Schwartz obligingly mailed the dog, cash on delivery. Mrs. Malik had a great laugh and found the $30 to pay for it. Annie's father, though, detonated. He paddled her fiercely. $30 wasn't joke money then. Buying the house in the valley had overextended his policeman's salary, and he was having a moonlight. Only after months did he let her have the doll. Annie remembered it as the first real whaling her dad ever gave her. Grabbing a pair of jeans folded on top of the dresser, a skirt, 2 blouses, and a halter top from the closet, a pair of platforms, and a pair of tennis shoes, Jeanie filled up the tote bag and took a last look around. She snatched the hairdryer and a round styling brush off the dresser. Holding that and Googs in one hand and the tote in the other, she headed back towards the living room. A throaty growl stopped her as she started across the black and white carpet. As her eyes adjusted, she saw, sitting on the purple and brown paisley couch in the shadows at the far end, a Great Dane staring at her. Slouched in a corner of the couch, her brown print housecoat blending into the background, was a small, worn-out-looking woman, Gladys, Annie's mother. The Great Dane growled again and made a forward movement, but was held to its place by Gladys' thin hand on its collar. We were going to call you, Mrs. Malik. My mom was going to call you, said Jeanie, approaching a few steps towards Annie's mother, who said nothing, only watched her through blank eyes. Mom wants Annie to stay with us a few days, if that's okay. Still no response. Gladys' dishwater blonde hair hung straight and lusterless and spiky, as though she'd just arisen from 2 days in bed and hadn't looked in a mirror yet. She looked disconcertingly like Googs, the doll, Jeanie thought. Just so her dad doesn't come with a straitjacket or something. If you won't tell him where she is. Jeanie's voice trailed off lamely as she watched the immobile woman. Gladys continued to stare a hole in her. Finally, Gladys picked a burning cigarette out of the ashtray on the end table and said in a deep, slow voice, I don't tell the man nothing. She took one puff and let her hand fall. The smoke trailed up and the cigarette burned. Jeanie shifted to her other foot and waited for more. Then came the slow voice again, as though from underwater. I don't deal with the man. We don't connect. Thank God. She fell silent. The cigarette burned. Jeanie absorbed what had been said and again waited. Nothing came. Hesitantly, she turned and took 3 steps towards the door. Then turned back. Gladys was staring across the room at the wall above the television. A huge, framed, mass-production painting of a hunting dog hung there. But the woman was looking right through it, her cigarette still trailing smoke. Jeanie turned and quietly let herself out. The sunshine hit her like a reprieve. Hurrying across the lawn to the pickup, she felt as though she'd been sprung from the hole. Brutal. Brutal, was all she said as she clambered into the cab and fired away from the curb. taking the four of them out of the neighborhood. Chapter 9, Foxes. Annie was wearing tight, new satin pants with the rolled bottoms that were dragging because she had taken off her heels and tossed them in the shopping cart. The tiny white halter, barely covering her breasts, heightened the warm apricot glow of her skin. She was showing a lot of skin on her midriff as she bounced along next to Jeannie and the shopping cart, both hands over her head, vigorously brushing at her silky red hair. A sort of grunt sigh made the two girls look over at the man coming down the other side of the aisle. He was a gaunt, middle-aged man with heavy-rimmed glasses and a huge forehead, pushing an empty cart as he turned into the aisle. His eye caught on Annie's vibrating, lightly concealed breasts and her creamy midsection. His jaw dropped, and a sound of pain inadvertently escaped him. He gaped as the girls moved past him, ignoring him. Annie went on, brushing her hair and chattering. I can't feel sorry for my mom. Not while she's taking shit from my dad. She gestured with her hairbrush. She could get money. I mean, she could have a life. She's not that old, don't you think? Jeannie was picking bags of potato chips off the rack and tossing them back. I mean, wouldn't you go bonkers sitting in that house all day? Boy, I would. Taking pain pills to sleep your life away. Jeannie was reading the front of a bag of chips. What do they mean, barbecue, cheese, onion flavor? How are you supposed to taste all that from a potato chip? She ripped open the bag and crunched a chip. She made a face and passed the bag to Annie, who extracted a chip and thoughtfully chomped it. She made a face. Shaving cream reminds me of. My dad actually made me eat some of that stuff once, from out the north. Tasted like barbecued potato chips, now that I think. She handed the bag back to Jeannie, who took it and read the back. No wonder. Listen, it's all chemicals. He's not really my dad, you know, Annie rambled on. Jeannie threw the bag back on the rack and took a bag of plain potato chips. Since when? She asked, thumbing her hair back and pushing the cart along. It's true, said Annie. Okay, it's true. Jeannie was reading the overhead signs, looking for tea and coffee aisle. Back in the flower children time, when people were all the time doing acid, I was like 11. Annie still had her hairbrush in one hand, flourishing it, though, as if it was accompanying the telling of a fabulous tale. One time, I dropped some acid, and it just came out. That guy, the cut, ain't my dad. No height. He just isn't. I saw my real dad, and I'm not shitting you. I saw him. Jeannie managed some enthusiasm for that idea. Yeah? What was he like? She asked, ceasing the forward roll and looking at Annie. Really cool. Somewhere between Cary Grant and the mighty Thor. Nothing got to him. Annie shuffled back and forth in her dragging pants, dusting the supermarket floor, waving her hairbrush. He was a motocross biker. Jeannie laughed. I don't see Cary Grant on a bike. He was. Roadhog or a Black Shadow or something. You're crazy, said Jeannie, starting up the progress of her cart again, smiling. He was so beautiful. Jeannie plucked some instant coffee off the shelf and dropped it into the cart. A cross between the Hulk and Vonnegut. That's what I would have probably seen on a hang glider. Jeannie laughed. Annie made a face. She leaned down and grabbed some packets of Flavor Aid off a low shelf and sailed them one by one into the shopping cart. Really, no fooling. How could I belong to him? It made sense, you know? The man with the heavy glasses and huge forehead appeared again. Coming at them, his mouth still slack and his glittering eyes fastened on the ripple of apricot skin. Uh-oh, hot breath, said Annie. The man was dawdling along, making little attempt to disguise his interest. Please just shine him, said Janie disgustedly. She pulled the cart back and started down the cross aisle.
God.
Annie put both her arms up high and started brushing her hair.
Whoa.
Elbows stretched back, pulling her breast taut. She flashed a wanton smile towards her admirer He walked his cart into the front corner of a display of jam jars, sending a whole stack of them cascading to the floor. Jeannie reached back and grabbed Annie by the arm, yanking her friend away down the cross aisle. Deidre and Madge were halfway through the checkout line when Annie and Jeannie chugged up with the cart full of junk food. Deidre, her hair tossed forward in a frizzed style that she figured was sultry and caused her to tilt her head slightly back to see from under it, held a single carton of strawberry yogurt up in 3 fingers as though it were a long cigarette. "That's all you're eating?" called Annie loudly. Deidre threw her a look. "Would you girls," she pivoted towards them and intoned under her breath, "kindly talk to each other?" She turned back towards the counter. "What's wrong with her?" Annie asked Madge, without lowering her voice. "What's always wrong with her?" said Madge. "Please," said Deidre, in her most sophisticated lilt. Jeannie and Annie looked at Madge quizzically. Madge motioned with her head toward the end of the checkout line. A blond, curly-headed boy was bending into his work.
Mm-hmm.
His bronze-skinned, slim suppleness, sculpted teeth, and bright blue eyes, bespeaking the distilled essence of youth itself, Southern California vintage. Each time he leaned forward to pick up an item, he cast an admiring glance at Deidre. For her part, Deidre was Camille. Each glance in his direction seemed to cost her the greater portion that remained to her of life's energies. She dropped her eyes, then raised them. Madge, between them, followed the glance like a tennis rally. The bend, the upward glance, the yogurt poised in hand. The sultry response.
Mm-hmm.
Pompity pom 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 pom. The heads all swiveled around. Annie was having trouble taking it quite in silence. She beat a tattoo on the moving belt with the palms of her hands. Deidre shot her an acid sidelong look without moving her head. "That's 38 cents, said the cashier, holding out her hand and looking tiredly in the other direction. "She's paying for it," said a sweet-voiced Deidre, dumping some coins into Madge's hands. "All this," said the cashier, wrinkling her nose at Jeannie's collection of junk food. Yes,
Yes?
said Madge, moving forward as Deidre squeezed past her. Her eyes big and soft, Deidre held out her lonely yogurt to the box boy. He looked up and gave her a handsome, sunny smile. Her eyes
Hello.
dropped modestly. "Arrgh!" A tiny strangling rattle rose out of Jeannie's throat, as though her spleen had attacked a lung. The box boy carefully blew open a small paper sack and slipped the yogurt carton in it. "This okay?" he said with another winner's smile. "That will be fine. Thank you,"
Thank you.
said Deidre, velvet in her voice. He held out the bag. She looked at it, back at him, and finally returned the smile. He smiled again. She took the bag.
Thank you.
You, Greg." "Huh?" His eyes widened. She reached an elegantly extended finger towards his name tag, almost touching it. "Greg," she said. "Oh, yeah, Greg," he said. He laughed it up. She gave him a light smile and turned to go, all ease and sophistication. He watched her. So did the girls. She walked off, making her bottom look round. Suddenly, as though her attention had been caught by a paperback book on the rack, she turned, reached toward it gracefully. Madge and Jeannie raised their hands to their heads as though having simultaneous strokes. Deidre glanced back at Greg over her bare,
Oh my
outstretched
God.
forearm. He smiled. She forced another of the dying Camille smiles, lasting a brief 2 seconds, turned back to the book for a minute, then withdrew her hand and slinked towards the door. Greg was transfixed. "Bam!" Jeannie slammed the counter in front of him. "Hey, let's pop the goodies in the goodie bag, huh?" He jumped, grabbed a sack, and shook it open,
Let's go.
and began loading under Jeannie's glowering eyes.